Hello YouTubers. Well, most of my videos deal with theology or politics. You shouldn't assume me to be scientifically illiterate. I didn't earn a Master of Science by talking about God or politics. My degree is actually in geography, specializing in GIS, since I earned my degree from a department that focuses on physical geography and the environment. I feel well equipped at addressing how we can effectively combat climate change. This video provides, well, the title says it all, provides a Republican plan for addressing climate change, but I also feel many progressives would enthusiastically support. Make no mistake, this plan is far different than any plan you've heard before, so please set all assumptions aside. First, I'd like to address an accusation I've heard a lot recently. Apparently, some have come to the conclusion that I'm a right-wing shill that's trying to get people to join the Republican Party. Such a view discounts my progressive nature. I'm a right-wing progressive shill that's trying to get people to join the Republican Party. I'll make another video on that sometime maybe, but keep in mind that this is a video of a Republican who is offering a solution for climate change, a major priority of progressives. For now, all I'll say is this. Look at this image. Why do you suppose there's no ingredient labeled liberal ideas for the recipe that Roosevelt is making? Well, this image was drawn early in the progressive movement. There's no ingredient labeled liberal ideas because the progressive movement originated from within conservatism, not liberalism. Teddy Roosevelt was trying to untie the Republican Party from laissez-faire. Even the original understanding of progressive, meaning the opposite of laissez-faire, far more reflects how the progressive movement arose from within conservatism, as its very ideology was defined in terms of conservative ideology. I make this point because it needs to be understood that you don't have to be a liberal to be a progressive. Now, on to climate change. Perhaps I'm being Captain Obvious here by stating that climate change is a reality and that we need to get our asses in gear to mitigate it. But let me also add that it's unwise to think that the Republican Party is against protecting the environment. Most Republicans are rural, after all, and have a strong affinity to nature. Even among Republicans who deny climate change, a lot of them agree that we should protect the environment. Republican or Democrat, I think it's likely that most people agree that an ideal solution to climate change is one that is effective, efficient, and grows the economy. However, many of the Republican establishment care more about existing businesses and job creation or the environment, and so deny the existence of climate change. Also, let me address the elephant in the room. Let's keep in mind that America isn't the only country in the world, shall we? Let's keep in mind that it's not even the country primarily responsible for pollution. America should lead in innovations and technology for combating climate change by cleaning up our own land, for sure. And that's exactly what my plan does. However, the bigger issue is this. Namely, China is the biggest polluter on the planet. China is a separate component of this plan, and the topic will be given its own video in the near future. For now, I'll simply say this. Any plan to address the global issue of climate change without considering Chinese pollution will fail to effectively mitigate climate change. Also, I'll briefly address the problem with democratic solutions, and for the thin-skinned, here's a huge trigger warning. The biggest problem is that the framework Democrats have adopted is inferior. Democratic solutions are not environmentally sustainable, let alone financially sustainable, so will not result in effective mitigation of climate change. Passing laws or instituting new regulations that are likely filled with loopholes, difficult to enforce, or even if strictly enforced and without loopholes, would still stifle business, isn't the best approach. The Green New Deal does that, plus it makes the wrong investments. It's far too costly and wouldn't help reduce global temperatures much. I'm not opposed to mitigating climate change. I'm opposed to stupid plans. In short, I'm convinced there's a far simpler and better solution than what's offered by the Green New Deal. Again, my plan is unlike anything heard before. I believe it offers compelling solutions that are pro-business and pro-climate. By comparison, my plan is much cheaper, creates a lot more jobs, and provides an effective solution that's environmentally sustainable. So by every metric, it's a better plan. But let me know your opinion in the comments section. This plan is a Republican plan because, unlike other plans, it would actually fight climate change without excessive or overburdensome regulations. There'd be far fewer regulations or new taxes under this plan when compared to a Democratic plan. The idea that we have to fight climate change by hefty taxes and a bunch of regulations is preposterous. It's unlikely that there would be any carbon tax, for example. If so, it would be minimal. My plan fights climate change without all that stuff, and does a far better job. It does so by building an infrastructure system that actually allows for the mitigation of climate change through economic growth and development. Rather than discourage growth, it encourages growth. This plan would create lots and lots of jobs in our nation, both for rural Americans and urban Americans. It would create one of the biggest, if not the biggest, periods of job growth in our country. We might have 100% employment, and needing lots of immigrants to come over, there'll be so many jobs. And while this plan makes huge investments in America, including several public works projects, it does so at a far cheaper cost than the Green New Deal. It sees an expanded government, but in a far different and better way. This plan lays the groundwork for a new American century. How does my plan mitigate climate change? By developing the infrastructure proposed below. It would take CO2, methane, and other troublesome greenhouse gases down to safe levels. It creates an actionable plan to deploy the newest in environmental technology and for transitioning to better sources of energy. The plan consists of three phases that, when complete, will have effectively mitigated climate change and overseen the transition to an environmentally sustainable society. It will take around 60 years to complete this plan. Don't think of it as a comprehensive set of policies as much as it is a set of plans to build the infrastructure necessary to effectively mitigate climate change. With the proper infrastructure in place, creating a sustainable environment in America will be easy. Combined with an effective foreign policy, which will be the topic of another video, we can defeat climate change. What do we need to do? Well, consider access to water, for example. One way to improve water access is to clean and purify the water better, and we should do that. However, a far better way to improve water access is to extend canals and other water channels. This is true even if the canals contain salt water, as desalination plants can turn it into fresh water. Which brings me to the first phase of my plan. Phase 1, the Great American Canal Network. Water access for planting forests, faster growing crops, and future development. For all the talk of CO2 and methane, do you know which greenhouse gas accounts for absorbing most of the heat in the atmosphere? Water vapor. 60% of all heat is trapped by water vapor in the atmosphere, not CO2, methane, or any other greenhouse gas. That's really important to understand because warmer air can hold more moisture. The more the temperature increases, the more moisture the air can hold, making heat waves more miserable and may act as a positive feedback, driving temperatures even warmer. Why does this matter? Well, keep in mind that we have little control over how much water vapor is put into the air. The good news is that we have far better control over the remaining 40% of heat absorption by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, of which CO2 and methane make up the majority. But keep in mind that every degree centigrade that the global temperature rises, the amount of water vapor in the air increases by around 7%. But a big unknown is what impact that has on a major driver of the amount of available energy the Earth receives, namely cloud coverage. My point isn't to deny human contributions. I'm pointing out that the majority of heat absorbed by the atmosphere is by a factor that's largely outside of our control. We don't really have much control over how much water is put into the air, after all. That makes it all the more important that humanity can successfully control anthropogenic forcing. CO2 accounts for the second most amount of heat absorbed by the atmosphere, while methane comes in third. Forgive me if it's simply my ignorance, but the methane cycle isn't as well understood as the CO2 cycle on Earth. And even though there's less methane in the air, methane holds 84 times the amount of heat than CO2. So it is 84 times more powerful than CO2. A big methane spike could bring devastating consequences. It's well known that the Earth has many features which naturally absorb CO2. The oceans absorb CO2. Plants breathe CO2 and exhale oxygen for humans to breathe. It's not as well known which natural features absorb atmospheric methane. Thankfully, there is evidence to suggest that In addition to absorbing CO2, forests also absorb methane. That's why planting many new forests and smarter agricultural planning is also vital to securing a sustainable environment. So, all things considered, CO2 is perhaps the most manageable greenhouse gas, but we should not assume that simply reducing CO2 emissions is going to solve the problem. It's not going to. At the very least, we need to take a significant amount of CO2 and methane out of the air. To simply do that requires developing infrastructure at a wide and massive scale. It's truly insane to realize the number of trees that have been chopped down just since Europeans came to the New World. And remember that forests absorb CO2 and likely also absorb methane. To truly combat climate change, we need to plant hundreds of new forests in almost every state. We also need to start planting crops that absorb more CO2, that is, crops with a higher rate of photosynthesis. A good example is hemp. It can be planted every year and is essential for making many useful products. It has a very high rate of photosynthesis and so is good at absorbing lots of carbon and putting out lots of oxygen. However, to plant so many forests, we need a lot more access to water. It requires a lot of water to plant a lot of forests, after all. The first step of phase one is to enable enough water access for planting those trees and crops, as well as begin developing the infrastructure necessary for a sustainable environment. This will be done by building a series of canals across the United States that, combined with desalination plants for canals that have salt water, will extend freshwater availability. This canal system will allow for increased cargo boat traffic, growth and development of towns and cities, increased water access to grow more forests, and provide water access for future phases of this plan. Building this network of canals would be a huge undertaking, but it needs to be done because it's a key component for enabling us to fight climate change far more effectively. Yes, let's clean the water we pollute, but perhaps more important, we need to extend access to fresh water. And building canals is one thing we've been pretty good at in our history. Also, during this phase, cities would be encouraged to become as green as possible. They would be encouraged to grow crops on roofs and anywhere else they can find room. This would help keep cities cooler in the summer and create a more sustainable environment. Once an extensive canal network is developed, a national tree planting initiative can be implemented, and with an expanded forest service. This phase lasts the longest, with a time frame of around 25 years. I've included these actions in phase one because they're easily achievable with only effort. We have the ability to extend our canal networks. We have the ability to plant trees, make better use of farmland, and make better environmental decisions for urban planning. These aren't high-tech solutions, but they are a huge step in the right direction environmentally. Politically and economically, it's also a major win. It would provide lots and lots of jobs for Americans, for one. First, building canals and then planting forests. Additionally, many communities will grow and develop with improved access to water. Such an extensive canal system would result in a greater influx of traffic and culture between rural and urban America, helping to more firmly unite our nation. Much as the aqueducts served the Romans, let an extensive canal network serve America. Before going over the second phase of my climate change plan, allow me to speak about regulations for a moment. Yes, we need effective and strongly enforced regulations for clean air and water. The problem is that the more regulations there are, the more difficult it is to enforce those regulations. So it's far better to have fewer regulations that are strictly enforced. That's why it's also far better to focus on improving freshwater access to more Americans and improving water filtration techniques than to focus on regulations. Not to mention that some Obama-era regulations have, at the very least, been criticized as being overburdensome and unhelpful. A good example of how Trump solved some of these issues is the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. Many Democrats advocate for a carbon tax, but consider the position that a carbon tax isn't particularly effective or helpful. Why? Because for one, loopholes will be created into a carbon tax. That's almost guaranteed. But perhaps more importantly, even a strictly enforced carbon tax without loopholes is a pretty terrible idea because it would stifle businesses without doing much to combat climate change. So much CO2 has been put into the air by now, that we couldn't reverse climate change even under the strictest carbon tax. Frankly, the best approach to less anthropogenic forcing is through cleaner and cheaper forms of energy. Designed correctly, an extensive canal network can lower our reliance on non-renewable fuels considerably, but energy usage is fully addressed in Phase 3. Phase 2. Implementing high-tech solutions for a sustainable environment. Phase 1 consisted of low-tech but necessary approaches to mitigate climate change by building a bioinfrastructure capable of absorbing CO2 and methane at a mass scale, while providing many other benefits that an extensive canal system would provide. Phase 2 is about deploying operational technology and infrastructure to actively remove CO2 and methane out of the air, as well as improving methods in water purification. What do I mean by active approaches? I mean, rather than the government having stringent regulations on the amount of carbon a business puts into the air, that the government help research, develop, and deploy current direct air capture methods of CO2 and methane so that they can be operational at a mass scale. Here is a question. When you capture a lot of CO2 and methane from the air, where are you going to store it? And how are you going to transport it? That's why having an extensive canal system is so helpful. And also, many new water filtration and desalination plants will spring up. With so many people learning about water purification, I suspect methods will improve naturally. This canal system is also essential for transitioning into new forms of energy. That's why building a system of canals will be so essential to creating a sustainable environment in society. Combined with massive scale direct air capture of greenhouse gases and a massive replanting of forests, we can effectively reduce the amount of CO2 and methane in the atmosphere. Phase 2 is estimated to last around 20 years and would start after Phase 1 for a total of 45 years. Phase 3. Implementing operationally efficient energy solutions at a mass scale. To create a truly sustainable climate for the long term, we need not only to remove the current excess greenhouse gases, but also transition to more efficient and more environmentally friendly forms of energy. This is exactly what Phase 3 does. I think the most promising development will be in harnessing the power of nuclear fusion to provide energy, although many avenues should be pursued. More efficient solar power, geothermal, anything to provide as cheap and as clean of energy as possible. Phase 3 is estimated to take 15 years because I'm gambling that research will have significantly progressed towards cleaner energy within the next 45 years. If this proposal is given serious consideration, Phase 3 will be explained in more detail, but the point is that Phase 1 and 2 work to remove the carbon out of the air, while Phase 3 prevents an excess of carbon from being put into the air. What's most important to understand is that an extensive system of canals will help in deploying almost every type of clean energy. For example, some areas may decide it's best to build a dam for creating a hydroelectric power plant, and fusion power plants would likely need to be built near rivers or large canals. Before going, let me offer this opinion. We did a fantastic job of screwing up the climate simply by acting upon the exploitive nature of humanity. That is, just being our natural selves. So we should be darn careful about intentionally trying to alter the climate. But we have to do something, and I believe this plan is the best. It could even help us avoid a war with China, as I'll explain in a future video. If you like this plan for climate change, please show your support by subscribing and spread the word. Thanks for your time.